Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm about to start topic one of Unit D, simple machines, or sorry, mechanical systems. Topic one covers machines are tools that help humans do work, and topic 1.1 will cover simple machines, while topic 1.2 will cover complex machines. We'll start by talking about what a machine is. We all know what the machines are. However, the earliest machines, they were very, very simple devices, and they required humans and or animals to run. So if you take a look at the picture here on the right, we've got a screw on the side with a crank on it. A human would have to crank that screw, and water would come up from a water reservoir to a higher area. And down here we have cattle turning a wheel, okay? A human turning a wheel. As time progressed, however, machines started using other means to operate. Okay, and we can think of that now. So we can think of steam, wood, electricity, natural gas, all those wonderful things. Okay, and some again, like I said, some of the examples here on the side, we've got aqueducts, which you guys learned about in social studies. We've got the Persian wheel down here, where the cattle are moving the Persian wheel. They turn this wheel and axle, and this in turn turns this one right here, which can go scoop out water and whatnot. And then we have our Archimedes screw. Remember, we talked about Archimedes a few times this year. Archimedes was the guy that thought light rays could hit mirrors and they could attack ships. And then also he discovered how to measure density of solid objects. He also created a screw that was able to transport water from a lower area to a higher area. So pretty cool things. Some of these things are actually used today. Many of these things are still used today. So machines and simple machines, continuing on with this. Machines are devices that help us do work. Okay, so every single machine we have, we use it because it helps us out. Okay, the earliest machines were known as simple machines, which were tools and devices made up of just one simple basic machine. Just one thing made it up. Okay, and each simple machine has advantages and disadvantages, which we need to be aware of. Okay, and it's important that we know what we're aware of them because it helps us know when we're just considering what to use. They'll help us make these decisions. So we're going to start by talking about the lever. And you guys already saw the lever on the lab that we covered that you guys did the previous day, or you started the previous day. Levers are simply a bar or a plank or something like that that can pivot or rotate. And that thing that it pivots and rotates on is called a fulcrum. Okay, they're great for moving large and heavy loads. Okay, especially with this setup right here, where the fulcrum is very, very close to the load. And we saw this in the lab. When the fulcrum is very close to the load that we're trying to move, it takes very little force to pull down, and we get a big force out. When the fulcrum is close, like in this picture here, the force pushed down would be less than the force needed to lift the load. Big disadvantage, or sorry, another big advantage about levers is we pull down and the object goes up. So even when the fulcrum is in the middle, okay, we can convert a downward force into an upward force. The force that we pull down will be the same as the force that goes up, but we change direction, which is also very, very useful. Okay. In order to do all of these, though, especially this one right here, in order to get a big advantage out of it, you have to pull a lot farther than where the load goes up. Okay, so in this case, it looks like you're pulling down about 3 times the amount that it rises. And we saw this in our lab the other day. There are 3 different types of levers. We're going to talk about them very quickly. You've probably seen these before. The first lever is the first class lever, and it's right here where the effort and the load are on either side of the pivot. All 3 of the levers we played with during our lab were first class levers. Okay, the pivot was just moved to different spots, but the effort and the load was always on either side of the pivot, or yeah, on either side of the pivot. And these are very similar to teeter totters, crowbars, any of those types of things. This one right here, the second class lever, it's a little bit awkward looking at it, right? The pivot is on one end, the load's on the middle, and the effort's on the side. This one's kind of, you look at it and have a hard time thinking of what kind of machine would make this up, but it's actually a really simple one. It's the wheelbarrow, okay? So we've all probably played with wheelbarrows, or we had wheelbarrow races. Right here, the pivot would be the wheel, and the handles would be over here, and then this would be the big bucket that holds the dirt and the gravel or whatever you're moving around. And lastly, we have our third class lever. Pivot is still on the end. The load and the effort switch. Okay, and perfect examples for these are, again, things that we use almost every day: hammers, axes, baseball bats, brooms, hockey sticks. Any of those things are third class levers. Okay, so the pivot would be, if we're imagining a hockey stick, the pivot, you would hold the top of the stick with, well, I use it with my right hand. The effort goes into your left hand, down into the middle of the stick, and then the load would be the blade of the stick where you're hitting the puck. Inclined planes or ramps are another simple machine that we saw in the lab, and that's all they are. They're just ramps, and they allow us to move heavy objects using a smaller force. And we saw this in our lab. It only took 2 newtons to move the 1 kilogram mass up 10 centimeters. Okay. In order to effectively do this, unfortunately, though, the big disadvantage is you have to move a greater distance. You can see this in this picture. They have to move this whole entire distance just to move it up that high. Okay. So yeah, you do have to move it a greater distance, but the trade-off is it uses a lot less force. Another thing you need to deal with ramps is friction. Okay, the smoother the ramp, if you think back to our lab the other day, that ramp was a nice smooth piece of shelving. If it was covered with sandpaper or something along those lines, it would be a lot harder to push. On the flip side, if we were to use a smoother paint on it or shine it up, it would have been easier to push something up that ramp. So you always have to deal with friction with these as well. Ramps are all around us. If you actually think about it, wheelchair ramps. Okay, I'm sure you've all seen wheelchair ramps. Roads, believe it or not, are ramps, especially with Airdrie. Airdrie is actually one of the highest elevated cities in the country. So because it's so high, we have to drive up a ramp. We have to drive up an incline to get into Airdrie. So next time you're driving out of the city or driving into the city, pay attention. Take a look away from your cell phone and take a look out the window, and you'll notice that you're actually traveling down a hill as you're leaving and up a hill as you're coming into Airdrie. And moving trucks, obviously, like in the picture, and then stairs. Stairs are also ramps. They're just different. They're designed differently, and that was mentioned in the Bill Nye video. Wedges are another simple machine. If you take a look at a wedge, it looks very similar to a ramp, but kind of flipped on its side. Okay, they're used in a very different way than the ramp, however. So if you take a look at the wedge right here, the one where my mouse is, you have a flat end on one side and a point on another. You put a big force or an input force down onto the flat end, that force goes through this wedge, and it's a greater force that's getting pushed through at the pointy end. And as you see with this picture, not only does it go down, but there's also outward forces pushing to the left and right. Okay. Unfortunately, big disadvantage with this thing is it can only be used in one direction. If you were to take this wedge and flip it upside down and try to bash onto the pointy end, that wedge isn't going to go anywhere. You're not going to do anything. You'll probably damage the wedge or damage your hammer. Examples include axes, so chopping wood, nails when you're nailing putting a nail into a board, knives, and high heels. Believe it or not, high heels, they're essentially wedges. You know, if you have really pointy high heels and you step on some soft grass and you put a little bit too much weight on that heel will go right into the ground. Next, we have our screw. So screws we've seen all over the place. I already showed you the Archimedes screw at the beginning. Screw is essentially a cylinder with grooves in it, okay, and that cut in a spiral on the outside. Okay, it increases the force you use by penetrating the materials using a small force. So when you're screwing in a screwdriver, you're not putting that much force into the screwdriver. A little bit of force down and then just twisting motion, but you get a lot more force out with that screw going into the wood. Okay, it also can be used by converting rotational, so the twisting motion, into a linear motion. So you twist left and right, and that screw goes up and down. Very, very useful. Disadvantages are it is fairly slow. So that Archimedes screw I showed you at the beginning, where they are moving water up from a lower area to a higher level. And if you actually take a look here, they're using an Archimedes screw to move Cheerios from the bowl to this bowl. It is actually quite a slow process. It doesn't move really, really quickly. So that is a disadvantage. We don't really think of it as an issue when we're screwing into some wood or whatnot, because a lot of times we just use a drill and that drill moves very, very quickly. But if we were to do everything by hand, just by twisting our wrists and whatnot, it would be a very slow and time-consuming job. So examples include the screw fasteners, augers. So if you've ever gone and drilled a hole in the ice for ice fishing, or maybe drilled a hole into the ground to put a post hole, those are called augers. And then the Archimedes screw. And then right here we have a corkscrew. We got caps for orange juice or whatnot. Looks like some sort of vice down here. And then I showed you the Cheerios Archimedes. Next, we have a pulley, and a pulley is another one that we saw during the lab that we did the other day. A lot of students are usually surprised by the results of the pulley. They think that the pulley is going to be the easiest method. And in some cases, it actually could be, just not in that lab. So a pulley is essentially a rope or a wire or a cable or something that's on a grooved wheel. And we have some pictures of them here. They are great at changing direction and force. That's one thing every single pulley does. If you pull down, the load goes up. Okay, so that's a great advantage. However, once we start adding more of these wheels, we end up by getting another advantage, and you can actually end up by pulling up a load using a lot less force. The more wheels, the more efficient it is. The less force it takes to pull things up. When I used to work in the field, I used to have to haul our boats, and we put our boats up on the walls and we leaned them up on the wall. They were pretty big and heavy boats, and I could do it with one hand using the pulley. Well, two hands, but just pulling it up very easy. Okay, we were able to lift that heavy boat, no problems at all. Disadvantage, however, I had to pull a lot of rope, because think about it, every time that the rope loops through one of these pulleys, it takes that much extra rope. So you have to pull way more rope, but you get a lot more force out of it. So examples include flag poles, winches, elevator cables, all those different things. Next is a wheel and axle. Wheel and axle is an odd one, but we see them everywhere. These are a combination of two different wheels of different diameters that turn together. So we have a wheel right here, and we have an axle right there. A perfect example is our doorknob. Okay, the longer motion on the wheel produces a shorter, more powerful motion down here on the axle. Okay, they can also be used to increase speed. Okay, so because this is a shorter one, this one full rotation will cause the smaller one to have more rotations. The drawback is that you need to turn the wheel a greater distance. Okay, so you have to turn the big wheel a greater distance than the axle actually turns. And examples of these include doorknobs and wheels on cars and bikes and those types of things. This is the last slide for the first section. I'm just going to do two short videos instead of one long one. And this talks about the effects of simple machines. You might want to pay close note to this if you want a colored picture. It's in your textbook. This might be on the quiz. But here are some of the effects of simple machines. First one is changing the direction, and we talked about that with the pulley on a flagpole or the lever, right? The lever does change the direction. Does some of them increase the force, but it also changes the direction. The other one is multiplying the force. For example, a screwdriver, you do a little bit of twisting and you get a lot more out. Increasing or decreasing speed. This is a big one. And I love the fact that they put scissors here. Some people aren't too sure what they mean by scissors, but think about scissors with the long blades. Okay, you can cut through something a lot quicker with a long blade. Your fingers, you only move your fingers this much, but depending on how long those blades are, they can go and do a lot more cutting. And then finally, transferring force. So something like the lever, the first class lever where the fulcrum was very close to the load. Here we have an example of a staple remover. So that's it for topic 1.1 of Unit D. We're going to go over, and I'll do another video for topic 1.2 very shortly. So you guys are going to likely have two videos for one day, but hopefully they won't be that long. All right.